right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ed Remus, and I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Welcome to this discussion of Norman Finkelstein's 2023 book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom, published by Sublation Press. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, the new 1960s to 70s, and the post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about Platypus's activities or find a chapter local to you by visiting our website, platypus1917.org, or by emailing platypusvirtual@gmail.com. For those of you here at UChicago, our campus chapter's reading group is held on Sundays in Harper 135 from noon to 3 p.m. Coffee breaks are on Wednesdays in Hutchinson Commons at 4:30 p.m. You can reach our local chapters by email at platypus.chicago@gmail.com. Norman Finkelstein is a political scientist, activist, former professor, and author. He's a graduate of Binghamton University, and he received his PhD in political science at Princeton University. Although his primary fields of research are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the politics of the Holocaust, he has spoken openly about his erstwhile beliefs as a Maoist activist, which he later came to reject. So Norman will speak about his book, and Norman, I'll give you the signal when we hit the 30-minute mark. If you end up speaking for that long, at that point you can wrap up. We'll transition to Q&A, during which I'll take one question at a time, and I'll moderate. I've been asked to bring our event to close at 4:45 p.m., so I'll invite Norman to give brief concluding remarks at that point. So with that, please join me in welcoming Norman Finkelstein.
You hear me? No.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I don't think that's right. You can hear me in the back? Yeah. I just had a colonoscopy, so it's getting too close. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is. I know what I'm talking about. Okay, folks, it's very nice to see you, and I'm going to try to be brief, basically because it's always for me an opportunity to hear from young people, hear what's on your minds, and to have a meaningful, substantive exchange of opinions, not devoid of humor. I'm very far from humorless, but on the other hand, we live in, as they say, fraught times, so we should have a serious conversation to the extent that we have the opportunity to do so now. I'll just give you some background how I came to write the book, and it's not actually irrelevant to the experience I spoke to this morning about my period, as it were, as a Maoist, and one of the most important lessons I learned from it, which is, negative lessons I learned from it, which is that you have to be open to hearing the other side, not just because of some liberal propriety, but because the other side is often a corrective. You're making errors, and the other side may have some knowledge that you don't possess or that you're ignoring, and it forces you to do enables you to do a correction when you are in error. So that was something I didn't do as a Maoist. I modestly say I was a voracious reader back then. I felt I needed to have a full grasp of the material I was espousing, but I was a very one-sided reader. I affirmed everything I believed in, and I dismissed everything I disagreed with. A lot of what was said on the other side was untrue, but I painfully had to realize a lot of what the other side was saying was true. And the shock, and it really was a shock for me when Mao Zedong passed and then the Gang of Four was overthrown. I was literally bedridden for 3 weeks. I was totally devastated. And my mentor, or one of my two mentors, Charles Bettelheim, who was, you might call, a leading Maoist in academia. He taught at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, and he was the head of the Franco-Chinese Friendship Association. And I was told later that when the Chinese Maoist experiment was overthrown, that he had been bedridden for about a month. It really was, when you take your political beliefs very seriously, those are kinds of devastating moments. A lot of people think that it was the McCarthy era that destroyed the Communist Party, but that's actually factually untrue. Remember, the communists, I'm here speaking of the American Communist Party, these were very hard-nosed, thick-skinned, hearty souls. They were used to the idea of going off to Spain to fight in the Civil War, then going off in World War II, and a McCarthy was not going to devastate them. Yes, it disoriented your life, but it wasn't going to devastate you. What destroyed the Communist Party was Khrushchev's speech in 1956, when, as it were, straight from the horse's mouth, people had to face the fact that, so to speak, they, meaning the other side, was right, and we were wrong. And that was the humiliation I had to suffer at that point when the so-called Gang of Four were overthrown. And it has always struck me, this is a piece of history which probably goes over the head of most of you, there are two great African-American figures of the 20th century. One was Paul Robeson, and the other was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Robeson was very close to the Soviet Union. His daughter studied in the Soviet Union with Stalin's daughter. His mastery of Russian was just stupefying. And he paid a very steep price for his support of the Soviet Union. His career was destroyed. How many of you even know who Paul Robeson is in this room? Okay, more than I expected. Okay, his career was destroyed, but eventually he ended up in seclusion around 1960-61, and he was only 60 years old at the time, and he never came out of seclusion. But if you see pictures of him in his period of seclusion, there are just a few. He looks like a shrunken man. He was physically very robust. He was a great actor and athlete. He played Othello. He was a physically very robust person, and it was as if his whole body has caved in. After Khrushchev's speech, the other side kept taunting him. When he went before McCarthy, they taunted him. What do you think of Khrushchev's speech? What do you think of the Soviet Union now? And of course, it was for him a mortifying experience. Not only that he was wrong, but the enemies who persecuted him were vindicated. It wasn't just that he was wrong. It was all those people who persecuted him while he stood firm in his beliefs. He famously said during the McCarthy hearings, "I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch." He stood fast to his beliefs, but the beliefs proved to be, in significant respects, mistaken, and those who persecuted him were vindicated. And it was that lesson, and as I experienced it, not during obviously the McCarthy era, but with the Mao era, that I became very humble about pretending to have a monopoly on truth. And also remembering, painful as it sometimes might be, listen to the other side. And you have to be able to answer them. And so now, with all the current woke certitudes, the refusal to brook any criticism, the dismissal of any critic as being a racist, in my case, even they now say a Zionist, and or a liberal, attaching all of these labels attaching labels instead of arguments. And in many cases, things that to me, and we can have obviously disagreements, things to me which I think are positively ridiculous. Not because of my knowledge of the subject, but because I defer to people who are knowledgeable. Are there more than two sexes? Do people get pregnant? Do people menstruate? I have many friends in the natural sciences, biologists, computer theoreticians, the top people in the world. And I admit, my knowledge of biology stopped in high school. I'm not proud of that fact, but it's a fact. So I would never render judgment. I turn to those who, to my understanding, are most knowledgeable on the topic. And my friends are much more woke than me. But on these particular questions, they remain, so to speak, conventional. That a lot of what's passing now for new truths and new understandings and new revelations is complete nonsense. I want to repeat, I do not say this somebody who claims any expertise in the area. It comes from people who I defer to their judgment. The other day, somebody sent me a clip from Richard Dawkins. I know, I don't like Dawkins. I don't like the new atheism. I don't like the scorn for believing people who have religious belief. If Isaac Newton had religious belief, then maybe religion isn't all that dumb, okay? So, I don't like him, but the other day somebody sent me a clip. He was interviewed by Piers Morgan, who was also a nasty piece of work in the UK. And the question of sexes came up. And Dawkins says, say whatever you care about is politics, everyone will agree. He's a very competent scientist. He's a very competent scientist. There's no disputing that fact. And Dawkins, Dawkins was asking the question of sexes. He said there are two sexes. And then the interviewer asked him, well, what about genders? And Dawkins says, I don't want to talk about gender. I'm talking about sexes. I'm talking about sexes. And that's the response I get from every scientist I speak to. And so then when you get these kinds of catechisms of wokeness, which don't brook any dissent, which then ostracizes you, turns you into a pariah, or in the contemporary lingo, cancels you, that remind me of my Maoist era. And it was learning from that experience that made me very skeptical about what's happening now. Now there are differences, and that's what I'm going to get to in the last brief part of my remarks, and then I'm going to open it up. So part of what prompted the book or provoked the book was my own history, my own period in my life as a Maoist. The other thing was something that was very revealing to me. You all know the expression, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So there are all these people who call themselves so radical and so cutting edge, and I'm kind of old-fashioned in my politics. But at the moment of truth, it was very striking what happened. You might ask, what do I mean by the moment of truth? In 2016, the Bernie Sanders candidacy emerged on the political scene, and even Bernie was shocked by what happened. Originally, he said, I'm going to just do some stump speeches to socialism and just keep alive the idea. And suddenly, like mushrooms after a rain, he discovers there are thousands, even tens of thousands of people showing up at these rallies. And a real movement seemed possible. For me, it was mesmerizing. A man going on national television denouncing the 1%, calling them all a bunch of crooks, denouncing Big Pharma, denouncing Goldman Sachs by name on national television. All of that was absolutely, completely unthinkable for my whole lifetime. It was totally beyond the ken. You couldn't imagine it. So this genuinely radical movement, probably the most radical political movement in 100 years since the Great Depression, roughly a century, the most radical political movement had a class struggle platform, and it embraced huge numbers of people. It wasn't the 99% of the Occupy movement. It was, 20% in our country, like, as in all the graduates of University of Chicago, are going to do just fine. But 80%, they're not going to live to see a better life than their parents and will most likely see a considerably worse life than their parents. And Bernie had carved together a platform that resonated with the 80%. As Brianna Joy Gray, who some of you might know, she mentioned, I was once on a program with her, and she was Bernie Sanders' national press secretary. And she mentioned that Bernie won every demographic under 30 years of age. Male, female, black, Latino, white, every demographic under 30, Bernie won. And as you know, in 2020, where most of you, your memories are clearer, in 2020, it's hard to believe because it's been so completely forgotten, even though it's only 3 years ago. Bernie seemed very close to winning until South Carolina. The leaders of the Democratic Party, like James Carville, were having heart seizure on camera. As you remember, Chris Matthews says if Bernie wins, they're going to shoot everybody down in Central Park. They were terrified at the Bernie locomotive. And as I said, until South Carolina, even South Carolina, the last week before the primary, the polls were showing Bernie was going to win. And then the squeeze came in. Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, he had promised not to weigh in between the candidates, but the screws were turned on him. He weighed in, supported Biden, and then the exit polls showed that 60% of black people were influenced by, Clyburn is black, by blacks' endorsement, and then Bernie lost, and then Obama stepped in, made the calls, told Pete Buttigieg to drop out, told Klobuchar to drop out, and then Elizabeth Warren, working in cahoots, in my opinion, with the Democratic Party, refused to drop out, and Bernie lost. Why do I mention that history? Because it was very striking that all the identity politics icons, all those super radical, cutting edge icons who made Bernie look so old fashioned and so out of touch, what did they do? One by one, Ta-Nehisi Coates starts denouncing Bernie Sanders because he's bad on black reparations. Angela Davis denounces Bernie because he doesn't have a good grasp of the race question. Kimberly Crenshaw, Ms. Intersectionality, she says to the New York Times' Sydney Ember, She says, "Oh, Bernie," now I'm paraphrasing, "he's just another one of those old white Jewish schmucks. The real action is corporate America," she said. Corporate America, they are the cutting edge, the vanguard on issues of race, on issues of human emancipation. They were who we should look to. We want leadership. If we want leadership, we have to look to Jeff Bezos, John Dorsey, and all the rest, or Jack Dorsey, or all the rest. And that to me was the telling moment that at its core, this whole wokeness ideology is so reactionary, so harmful to genuinely leftist aspirations. And in my opinion, that's where I'll leave it off. People have often asked, because some of you will know that famous moment where Brianna Joy Gray asked this young woman, "What do you mean by wokeness?" And she had written a whole book on the subject, and she couldn't answer the question, and it was a supreme humiliation for her. So somebody asked me, "What do I mean by wokeness?" And I thought about it. It was a fair question. And where I asked, I would say, I don't much care about the intellectual roots of all of these newfangled ideas. I'm more interested in it as a political phenomenon. And I would say wokeness has three aspects to it. Number one, it's been instrumentalized by the Democratic Party to fill a void in the party. The Democratic Party used to be the party of the white working class. And as the union movement hollowed out in our country, and large numbers of white workers either defected from the Democratic Party or joined the Republican Party, there was a void at the base, and every party needs a base. Doesn't mean the base incorporates everyone, but they need a strong core. And the Democratic Party decided to instrumentalize identity politics in order to create its base. And you see it, there's a kind of very cynical way to look at it. So Biden comes to power, he chooses a black female vice presidential candidate. He then says, "I'm going to choose a black Supreme Court candidate, nominee," and then he chooses a black lesbian press secretary. So he's lining up his ducks for the woman vote, the black woman vote, which is actually a critical demographic. It's a calculation. Number two, the woke politics has weaponized identity in order to stop a class-based politics. That was the role it played in 2016 and 2020. I've read a large part of that literature. If you read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, you have my condolences. If you read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, if you read Ibram X. Kendi, if you read, all these folks, there's like a stray fragment about class, but that's it. There's no class component to this to speak of in this so-called woke ideology. It's devoid of class. There's only one aspect of class that they cling to, and that aspect is they want to be 13% of the 1%. If we talk about the 99% versus the 1%, they want to be 13% because African Americans are about 11% of our population. What is it now? Is it closer to 11 or 13? I can't remember now. They want to get what they want to end the disparity. But ending the disparity just means proportional representation in the 1%, the top tier. That's the only aspect of class that ever comes into play when you read these treatises. And the third aspect of the woke politics is liberal, very wealthy, white people who want to show how progressive they are, to show how radical they are, without having to give up any of their privilege. So you get to be down with the hood because you invite Angela Davis to speak in Martha's Vineyard. I'm surprised you're laughing. That's literally the case. I was watching a video. Angela Davis is speaking at the University of South Carolina. And this blonde-haired Southern belle comes up to introduce her. She's the second richest billionaire in South Carolina. And she gives an introduction. You can find it on the web because that's where I found it, in which she speaks only half mockingly or ironically about how much she and Angela have in common. That's how you get to have this radical veneer, this radical patina, without having to give up any of your privilege. Now, there was a time when to be a radical, it meant, the expression used, maybe it's a little bit dramatic, but it was called committing class suicide, which meant giving up all your privilege and sacrificing yourself in very significant ways, including jail time and death. That's what it meant to be a radical. And nowadays, what does it mean to be a radical? It's not Rosa Luxemburg going to jail once, twice, 3 times. You read Rosa Luxemburg's letters. She was a voluminous letter writer. One of her biographers said it's hard to imagine she had any time left in the day because she was just writing so many letters. You read the letters, there's never a word of complaint about being in jail. And then at the end of her life, when she gets out of prison, because she was in prison for most of World War I, she gets out of jail, and people were shocked. She had a thick shock of hair, and it had turned all white in jail. And she came out frail, feeble, physically feeble, and she was already 47 years old, which by our standards would be about 57 years old or even more. She went right from the jail to the revolution in the literal sense. There was a German uprising at the time, workers' uprising, and she went right to lead it, not missing a beat, not missing a breath. And then people said, Rosa, you're being hunted down. You're being hunted down. You should get some bodyguards. She said, no, I go where I lead others to go. And Rosa was killed. Her head was smashed, she was tortured, and thrown in the water. For my generation, those were deeply inspiring moments. Histories, traditions, people. If I tell you, Rosa graduated #1 in her class, she would have gotten the gold medal, except they said she was too unruly. She was one of the first females to get a doctorate degree in economics from the University of Geneva. Lenin, he graduated first in his class. He got the gold medal. He wasn't yet politically active. Then Lenin, he has to go to law school because he needs a career. Normally law school takes 4 years. Lenin was in exile. He was in political exile at this point. He studied for 1.5 years and then asked permission to take the exam. He takes the exam. In order to graduate with distinction, there were 12 subjects. You had to get at least a distinction in at least 6. Lenin got a distinction in 12. That was the generation who gave up everything and anything for the cause, for the revolution. It meant sacrifice. It meant commitment unto the death, literally. It meant commitment unto the death, and you never talked about it. It wasn't even a subject of reflection. It came as it were with the turf. That's what it meant to be a revolutionary. And then I'm doing some reading, and I Google Judith Butler's name for something just to check a fact. And I come across this big headline from 2020. A world historic moment was unfolding before my eyes. Something the equivalent of the Chinese Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution. On this date in 2020, Judith Butler declared that her new pronouns were they, them. That's wokeness. It's so laughable. It's so contemptible. And the idea that that's passing for radicalism, well, I decided to write a book. Okay.
Thank you, Norman. So we'll kick off Q&A now, and I'd like to pose a two-part question just to get us started, and hopefully someone can go around the room with a mic to sort of get to those who have questions in the meantime. So as you mentioned, one of the through lines in your book is the recent history of the Democratic Party establishment weaponizing identity politics, using it as a means of discrediting Bernie Sanders, his candidacy, and his supporters. And so I'm curious, in relation to that, it strikes me that a political party like the Democratic Party, to build, as you mentioned, a base of support requires not just the recent period of history, but often decades. And so I'm curious if you could give some account, like what history or what theory would you give before the Sanders era of how and why identity politics grew in the neoliberal period, going back to the 1960s and 1970s. What is the deeper history of that in politics and in society? And then the second question I have, I mean, it occurs to me one tension, one conflict that might play out in our Q&A would be between those on the left who would uphold Bernie Sanders and democratic socialism and those who would consider themselves farther to the left. And that's certainly a discussion and debate that we would be happy to have play out. But setting that debate aside for a second, I think you would acknowledge that the historic horizons of the left, the political horizons of figures you quote and discuss, like Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, were actually far greater than the kind of popular frontism that democratic socialism comes to embrace in the late 20th century. And so I'm curious, leaving Sanders aside politically, what do you think are the larger political stakes for the left in a larger sense in light of its historic horizons?
On the first question, obviously, for those of us who have something of a historic memory, obviously there are strong resemblances between the current wokeness and the PC, political correctness, of the 1990s, roughly 1990s. People forget, I think, political correctness was a term coined by the left. It wasn't a right-wing coinage. We were mocking the kinds of robotic pretenses of what's right and what's wrong in contemporary society. And I think that was probably, as you know, many people who were part of the New Left, they ended up going into teaching because they were looking for a place to influence people, quote unquote, enlighten people. And since the proletariat didn't rise to the occasion during the 60s, for those of us who called ourselves Marxists, the next likely place to go was to go into academia and try to influence the ideas of young people. And I think it's not entirely false to say that same kind of what we called back then Marxist-Leninist mentality of we possess the truth, where the vanguard, everybody else is stupid or suffering from what was called false consciousness, that everybody else needed to be enlightened by us, and then was hatched the political correctness. But the very big difference between political correctness and today's identity politics is power. Political correctness was such a marginal phenomenon. It was pretty much restricted to academia, and it was just on the margins of academia. Yes, it affected some fields, it affected some disciplines, but in such a marginal way. And the main critics of this political correctness were organs like the New York Times. And it's just a very striking phenomenon how the New York Times has now become the instrument of identity politics and wokeness. If you go back, I'll just give you one example, which is very striking. You will believe it, but it was very striking. So one of the reactionary texts of the 1990s was Herrnstein and Murray's The Bell Curve. How many of you know the book, The Bell Curve? Okay. Well, the bell curve is about IQs, but really the bell curve was about one thing. It had hundreds of pages of appendices, but everyone knew what the bell curve was about. It said black people might in fact be genetically stupider to white people. Everything else was just, space filler. That was how they were going to sell the book. Now, that got a very positive review from the New York Times. Go back and look. A huge review in praise of Murray and Herrnstein. That's unthinkable today in the pages of the Times. The Times is now the storm center of wokeness. In fact, there was this Canadian geneticist of sorts, and he had written another book at the same time. The book claimed there is a direct correlation between penis size and intelligence, and you can fill in the rest. That was also praised in the page. Wait, did I say no, inverse. I don't know how I did that. I should have known because I saw a lot of guys smiling. Guys, they're inversely related. So that too was praised in the pages of New York Times. That sort of stuff is unthinkable now. The Times has gone completely woke. And so the big difference now between the political correctness then and the wokeness now is there is a significant power party, the Democratic Party, significant mainstream cultural institutions, be it the Times, be it Atlantic Magazine, who just love to quote or have contributions by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and currently in the March 23rd issue, Ibram X. Kendi. So Jeffrey Goldberg can show just how down with the hood he is. And MSNBC, the mainstream institutions of our society have adopted wokeness. And what was extremely revealing for those who care about politics, what was extremely revealing is during the Bernie campaign, the Times was hyper woke. It was endorsing all the George Floyd demonstrations. It even gave a pass to tearing down the monuments. So it was hyper woke, and it was viciously, virulently furiously anti-Bernie, the Times. They had this character who covered the Bernie beat, Sidney Ember. If you recall, at one point, Bernie had the heart attack. And Sidney Ember ran with it. If you can just give me the book for a moment. This is a book I named Norman Finkelstein. It's not a bad book, I think. I want to just read something. You have a moment.
I remember that line. It's a good one.
Yeah. So this is what a typical Sidney Ember column read during those Bernie months after he had a heart attack. Bernie Sanders, who suffered a heart attack, reportedly suffered a heart attack. The hospital in which Sanders, who suffered a heart attack, is convalescing, issued a statement that he suffered a heart attack. Although Sanders, who suffered a heart attack, was in the hospital for less than 3 days, it remains a matter of grave concern that he suffered a heart attack. That was Times coverage, but it was very interesting to watch. Ultra woke, ultra anti-Bernie. And that's the difference with the political correctness of my era. The most scornful of political correctness in that era were the mainstream liberal institutions. The ones now that have adopted wokeness as their selling point. On the second question of the Democratic Party, I would like you just to my memory's clear, but there were several questions sort of compressed in your question. If you could just give me the point that you would want most me to comment on.
Yes. Setting aside Bernie Sanders and his campaign for a moment, if we view the recent history and present and future from the perspective and the political horizons of historical Marxism with which you're familiar, what, if any, are the stakes of identity politics for that view, as opposed to a democratic socialist view?
Okay, I'm going to just make I'll make a couple of comments, but I want to hear from the audience, so just a couple of comments. Number one, it's often forgotten, or now it's being forgotten, it certainly wasn't forgotten in my day, that the left always recognized there were certain, what were called back then, questions, which were not reducible to the class question. The class question also went by the name of the social question. It was called the class question, the social question. However, anybody who was active since the end of the 19th century in left politics, knew that the left always contended with what was called the class question, the class question, but also the woman question. That's what it was called, the woman question, the Jewish question, the Negro question, as it was called. That is to say, questions which everybody recognized were not reducible to the class question, that there were aspects of those questions, woman question, Jewish question, Negro question, there were aspects of those questions which were not caught entirely by the issue of class. So Kimberly Crenshaw thinks she's invented something because she came up with a nifty buzzword, intersectionality. But that's as old as the hills, that idea. And it's also true to say that the left probably never found a satisfactory resolution to how the two relate to each other. How does class relate to the women question, to the Jewish question, the black question? And there was a lot of serious contention among, say, black militants in particular, but also mostly black militants about the way the Communist Party, for example, dealt with the black question. But it was always there. Where did International Women's Day originate? March 8th of every year. All of you ever hear of International Women's Day? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Where did it originate? In the Soviet Union.
Second International
Women's Day.
Yes.
Was it? It was called Working Women's Day. Okay, that's possible. Okay. What was the first country in the world to legalize homosexuality? What was the first country in the world? The Soviet Union. Russia. Under Lenin, that first period. So those issues were always part and parcel of the left. The big difference between the identity politics now and the identity politics, if you want to use that expression, of the old left, the big difference is the identity politics now has lopped off the class question. It was always assumed on the left that there is no possibility of resolving the woman question, the Jewish question, the Negro question. There was no possibility of resolving it unless there's a resolution also of the class question. The two went hand in hand. What happened with identity politics is they lopped off the class aspect and just kept the identity aspect because they don't give a darn about the class. They want to be part of that 1%. And it's a very striking thing. It's a very striking thing, in my opinion, that because there's now such a huge chasm in the distribution of wealth in our society, because the chasm has grown so wide, the people in charge have so much money. I know that sounds crude, economistic Marxism, but as Alexander Colburn once said, crude Marxism is always a good beginning. They have so much money that there are a few people in this room, just a few, who are roughly of my age cohort. Just a few. There used to be a program on TV. It was a drama series. It was called The Millionaire. How many people remember that program? Okay. I guess there's only one person in this room my age. And The Millionaire was about this philanthropist who used to give out $1 million to some poor do-gooding person. And each week we would watch the program. And when the person got the $1 million, this guy named Mark Anthony, I think was his name, he gave the check for $1 million. And we would all be so thrilled, so mesmerized. $1 million. It was like beyond comprehension. Beyond comprehension. Now, Jeff Bezos, he gives Obama $100 million. He gives Van Jones $100 million. Now, yes, some smartasses in the room are thinking, well, Finkelstein forgot about inflation. Believe me, it didn't go up 100 times. I'm not that old. Maybe 10 times. Jack Dorsey gives this certifiable imbecile, Ibram X. Kendi, gives him $10 million. They have so much money Why do I mention it? Because those identity politics icons who want to get into the 1%, guess what? It's actually realistic now, because there's so much money to go around. I read the other day Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project. She made $1 million last year just in lectures at universities. One school gave her $100,000. $100,000. That's good money. That's good money for spouting nonsense. What does Ibram X. Kendi spout? I wrote a 100-page parsing of his books. There's nothing there. You know why he gets $10 million? Because he's got dreads, and he got a crowbar to stick an X into his name. That's it. It's all a fashion statement. It's a fashion statement by empty-headed imbeciles. But for the rich, you know why they gave Obama $100 million? Why Bezos gave him $100 million? You know why he gave Van Jones, who's black, $100 million? You know why? Because Bezos is no fool. He sees the writing on the wall. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but there's going to be a joint national action on Amazon. The workers will eventually organize. Now, here's a simple question. Does anyone want to guess what side Obama and Van Jones are going to be on when that strike occurs? Doesn't take rocket science. So, it's just for the rich. It's an insurance policy. It's a life insurance policy. And it's worth the money, because really, what's $200 million to Jeff Bezos? It's a toothpick for the rest of us.
So, Danny, someone can get the microphone to Danny.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. That was very illuminating. And I was thinking about the way in which the New York Times would have attacked Bernie Sanders for wokeness, and what also was behind that was their concern for maybe also Donald Trump winning, meaning to the degree that Bernie Sanders could have undermined Clinton's, candidacy, or in 2020, whoever they were going to choose. They kind of associated Donald Trump with Bernie Sanders. And in fact, Donald Trump also railed against the banks. He called them killers. He said Bernie Sanders had really good ideas in May of 2016. And I think about where the left was in 2017 when they were, kind of hyped up on anti-fascism. And for them, their politics meant basically going to anything associated with the alt-right or the alt-light or whatever the name was, and deplatforming. And to me, I guess when I think about that, that says something about the kind of history of how the left thinks about politics, that it has to kind of prevent ideas from being passed on. There was this question of, they would say legitimizing fascism. Like if people hear an idea, they're going to turn into a fascist. And actually says something about even their contempt for, we could say, the masses of people, that they think they wouldn't be able to think about things. So I was wondering about how you kind of relate the thesis and the cancel culture also to the era of Donald Trump, because I feel like that's also in the background and related to Bernie Sanders. But thank you again. That was great.
In the first part of the 20th century, you had a real workers' movement, and the workers' movement had identified institutions of its own. And so it was very easy to identify the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the trade unions. Those were bulwarks of the working class. And then there were other parties which are representative of other classes in society. So, when you read, for example, Leon Trotsky, the collection of his writings called The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany, he describes fascism as a policy of a lower middle class party acting in cahoots with the ruling class, the dominant economic class, in order to destroy all class-based workers' institutions. So there was a fairly clear dichotomy. I mention this because today it's much more complicated. The Republican Party has large numbers of white workers now in its base. It's not just a party of the lower middle class, as the Nazis were described. It has a heterogeneous, at least if not base, supporters, in election time. And so it's not so, I don't think it's accurate to equate the Republican Party, if you include its base, I don't think it's accurate to describe it as a fascist party. And in the same way, the Democratic Party, yes, it has a working class base, but it also has a large, powerful, ultimately determining wealthy class. It's not a typical working class party as it was understood in the first half or the first 4 decades of the 20th century. And so now, I thought Bernie's strategy was the correct one. He went on Fox News. Everyone's, how could you be on Fox News? They're fascists, they're agents of, they support Trump. And Bernie said, no, I want to win over the white working class. I think I have a shot at it. And in my opinion, actually, if Bernie had won the primary, which, as I said, is not such a big if for those whose memories are clear on what happened, if he had won South Carolina, it was clear he would have won Super Tuesday, and it would have been over. He would have won. And very strangely, I know it sounds like pie in the sky, but it really wasn't. From 2016 to 2020, it was very close to us sitting through Bernie Sanders' presidency, not a Donald Trump, because I think Bernie would have wiped the floor with Trump during the debates. But I think Bernie did the right thing, that you can't write them all off as fascist. If you do that, you're writing off a large part of the white working class. And that doesn't make any sense to me. Remember, one of the core ideas of the socialist movement, one of the core ideas was, in the words of the Occupy movement, we are the 99%. Marx anticipated that the capitalist system would, at one pole, the so-called 1%, would be consolidated at one pole, all the wealthy, the rich, the powerful, and then at the other pole, as Marx puts it in the famous passage in the first volume of Capital, he calls it the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, and at the other pole are the 99% who have nothing, the wretched of the earth. So it was always the understanding of the socialist movement that we represent the overwhelming majority. But I don't think we can reasonably hope to win if at best we represent 50%. I don't think you can win with 50%. Why? Because the other side has all the power. It has the institutions. It has the media. It has the wealth. It controls everything. That's not paranoia. That's a fact. We have on our side just one thing. We have numbers. We have numbers. If you can inspire those numbers, you can do pretty spectacular things. But we need a lot more than just squeaking by with 50% or 51%. And if you write off everybody in the Republican Party, you're writing off half. And I don't think you can win with half. I think Bernie could probably have gotten 20 or 30% of the white working class had it come to a general election, because people, it was very striking, and since you got YouTube, you can check it. When Bernie was on Fox, the moderators, the audience, they were extremely respectful of him because he came across as the real deal. He wasn't just another crook with the slogans, the popular slogans. And it was very striking. Where did Bernie get the worst reception? MSNBC. It's very telling. It's very telling. So there are many practical reasons why you shouldn't deplatform anybody, and I'm very firm on that point. I did make an exception, not an exception. It was consistent with my belief. When Amy Wax, as most of you know from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, she's coming under now a lot of attacks because of her racist remarks. And I don't think she would quarrel with the word racist. She has her own euphemism. She says, I'm a race realist. In other words, realistically, black people are inferior to white people, genetic evidence, and so forth. So she came under attack, and Glenn Greenwald had her on his program. And she espoused her views. I thought, how many people saw that program? Oh, I'm really surprised. Okay. I thought Glenn was quite effective at what he's good at. He's a lawyer by training. Rather than putting anything in her mouth, forcing her to espouse on camera, on national television, espousing her views. And then, because Glenn is a First Amendment fundamentalist, he asked me to appear on the program. I think he expected that I would agree with her right to academic freedom. I did not, because as I say in the book, I think that all speech that contains even the hint of an idea, has to be open to rational inquiry and debate. But there are some forms of speech that do not contain what you might call an ideational content. So, nobody has the right at a university. In my opinion, the ACLU disagrees. In my opinion, you don't have the right to call a fellow student a nigger, a kike, a cunt. You don't have that right. Why? Because when you enter a university, you're signing a kind of contract. We're here to exchange ideas. That's why we're here. We're trying to find truth. That's the motto of Harvard, veritas. And so there should be no taboos put on speech which have an ideational content. There's some idea there. But at the other pole, there are kinds of speech which have no ideational content. They're the equivalent of a verbal club. They're designed not to promote the exchange of ideas, but to stop ideas dead in their tracks. As in, you raise your hand, you want to contest the point of view, and I say something like, you stupid cunt. Does that advance the pursuit of truth? Well, obviously not. And I found that certain of Amy Wax's statements crossed the line. So among her statements, she's a very smart woman, and we shouldn't take that away. I'm not taking it away, we should acknowledge it. She got her MD from Harvard Medical School. She then got her JD from Harvard Medical School. She is, by any reckoning, a very accomplished scholar. She also happens to be a very nasty piece of work. But nasty pieces of work should also have the right to debate ideas. However, when she made statements like Asians, Indians, there are too many of them in science and medicine. They're poisoning the disciplines. That's the word she used, poisoning. Well, my parents passed through the Nazi Holocaust. My mother attended Warsaw University before the war in the mathematics faculty. And as you know, there was many a Nazi professor who was saying that there are too many Jews in higher education, too many Jews in the medical profession, too many Jews in the legal profession. These Jews are poisoning the intellectual life of Germany. So to me, it would have been a complete betrayal of my parents' martyrdom if I were to defend those remarks. She said a lot of things about black people. Cognitive abilities are inferior to white people. She actually said, it was not entirely surprising, the cognitive abilities of women are inferior to the cognitive abilities of men. All of those I accept. There's an idea there, you can argue it. But I don't accept the verbal clubs. So with that one exception, I am against all prohibitions and taboos on freedom of speech. And I'll tell you something, a book rarely has an impact on you until you are ready for the book. You're mentally ready for it. Had I read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty while I was a Maoist, I would have said, bourgeois liberalism, bourgeois this or bourgeois that. After I was devastated and destroyed morally by what happened in China, I picked up Mill's On Liberty. I read it again, I read it again, and I probably now read it a good 20 times. And lucky for you, by coincidence, I'm wearing my Mill t-shirt, and my favorite line from Mill's On Liberty is that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. Yeah. Notice, Mill doesn't say that so few dare to be individuals. No, he pushes the envelope. That so few dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. And there's a lot of wisdom in Mill, which I quote probably at excessive length in the book, about why we should let everybody have his or her say, and there should be no taboos, with that one narrow exception. It happened, in my opinion, that narrow exception kicked in the Amy Wax case. And I think, I haven't spoken to Glenn Greenwald since then, I think he was a bit disappointed at my response because he expected I would say no taboos, no prohibitions across the board. I said no, I can't. I felt she crossed the line, And I had two vivid memories of the stories of my parents trying to study at university. For those of you who don't know, Jews had to sit in the back of the lecture hall. They weren't, I used the wrong verb. Jews had to be confined. They were confined to the back of the lecture hall. They weren't allowed to sit. They had to stand. And at the end of each lecture, the fascist thugs would attack them. For those of you who've seen the very excellent film, how many of you have seen the film Julia?
Norman, if I can interrupt, we really do
Yeah,
need to get a
okay.
few other questions in here. I did see a question from Pam in the back. If someone could bring her a microphone, please.
Yeah, maybe just going back to something that was said earlier about the Democratic Party and the workers and the working class. You called the Democratic Party the party of the working class, and then you qualified and said it means something different than what it meant in the early 20th century. You know, it seems to me, Ed and I attended a conference recently where clearly there were a lot of Democrats in the audience that were anti-woke, but they were definitely not Marxists and definitely didn't want to see the Democratic Party become the party of the working class. And it seems now that there is a trend towards anti-wokeism as a way of renewing the numbers, renewing the base of the Democratic Party. And I think that what that anti-wokeism and party is going to look like is by turning concerns about labor into just another identity, right? So like the workers are just another identity. It's not the social question that is the social question of the unfreedom of society of the whole, but rather it becomes like, how do the workers get their interests met? And aren't you speaking from a position of privilege when you don't include the workers in the identity politics group? And that's what the new Democratic Party ideology is going to sound like. So, like, keeping that in mind, I was just wondering, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez helped to pass legislation that stopped the rail workers from striking in November of last year. Clearly, with those of us who are interested in creating the opportunities for an independent working class political power in the United States, saw that as evidence that the Democratic Party continues to be the party of the capitalists, that there are two capitalist classes in the United States, and they're called the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And at the SWP workshop that we had yesterday, one thing that was raised was that when the workers voted for Trump, what it showed was that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had lost the working class in the United States. And that presents an opportunity of sorts. But I wonder how much we squander that opportunity when we call the Democratic Party the party of the working class, and then lead them to people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who votes against the strike of the workers. So I know this is part of comment, but maybe just to return to this comment of yours of the Democratic Party as the party of the working class, of what are we squandering when we say that? Thanks.
Well, you said many things, and I feel a lot of what you said was very sharp, shrewd, and I wish I had covered it. When I said that the Democratic Party was seen as the working class party, well, since FDR, since the New Deal, the Democratic Party has been seen as the party of the working class. It was the party of the trade unions. That was their base, the Democratic Party. When I say their base, I'm not talking about their money base, their electoral base. When the unions began to disintegrate, not that they were ever a large part of our society, at best, it was at the peak moments, it was in the 30%. Now it's down to, I guess, below 10, it's about 8% now of the mostly public service workers. So that's, as close as we had to a working class party in this country, as close as we had, it was a major party, was the Democratic Party. But I want to get to the substantive questions rather than debating the class nature of the Democratic Party. The substantive questions, well, first of all, I totally agree with you. Well, there are two things to say. Number one, the wokeness may be on its way out. You can there are ways to gauge this woke phenomenon, where its current standing is. I think the most revealing one, I know you guys will laugh at me, I think it's Whoopi Goldberg. So Whoopi Goldberg is kind of the incarnation of wokeness. She's got the dreads, she's got the granny glasses, and she's so hip and she's so cool and she's hyper stupid, which is why she's so wildly promoted. And lately, in case you haven't noticed it, Whoopi has been attacking wokeness. She's had these several outbursts on that very important cultural phenomenon called The View, in which she has devoted quite a lot of time to saying the wokeness is out of control. They now want to rewrite Roald Dahl. They want to rewrite James Bond. They want to rewrite, I forgot all the other ones. And so when she starts attacking it, then you know wokeness has overstepped. It's overreached, and it may be in decline, which of course saddens me because that means book sales will consider. Can't I be practical once in my life? So it may be on decline because it really has overreached in its lunatic propositions. The other point you made was about the Democratic Party wavering about giving up on the white working class. And that's most evident, of course, in Joe Biden. Because, for example, in his last State of the Union address, it was clearly pitched to the white working class, making all these promises, none of which, of course, he's going to follow through on. But he realizes, I need that base if we're going to win against the Republican Party. I think the way you put it was very smart. You said they're trying to turn the working class into another identity, as against the core, because we're at the core, it would then, its logical conclusion would be to threaten the wealth and power of the powers that be, which is why they all loathe Bernie Sanders. Not because he was threatening a socialist revolution, that's sort of very, very far-fetched, but because he was even, remember, this ruling class is just utterly, I don't want to sound like some sort of soapbox orator, but it's so greedy. I mean, it's so kind of mind-boggling. You don't want to give railway workers one sick day? One sick day? I mean, that's just barbaric. That's just barbaric.
Norman, if I could just press, I think, what was the point of Pam's question a little bit. It seems that democratic socialism, going all the way back to its support around the McGovern campaign back in 1972, the formation of DSOC in 1973, sort of consistent line of Michael Harrington and his followers and descendants, has been in the train of the logic that Pam described, essentially integrating the working class in the Democratic Party as a constituency alongside the identity-based and other constituencies of the party. And so I guess just to maybe press the point, you've described how the kind of limitations, failures of Maoism prompted you to undertake a profound intellectual reevaluation and consider that perhaps you had been fundamentally wrong or mistaken. And what strikes me is that the experience of the two campaigns of Bernie Sanders seem to have potentially had the opposite effect on you in terms of doubling down on a politics that would be broadly described as democratic socialist in nature, an attempt to turn the Democratic Party towards a more redistributivist, class-oriented, working class-oriented politics. And so I'm wondering, would you say that that's correct? The two campaigns of Bernie Sanders have demonstrated to you that you've been right all along in democratic socialism, or are you coming to actually question that in any way?
I never described that. I don't care for the labels, labels mean absolutely nothing to me. The Bernie Sanders candidacy showed a possibility. It demonstrated a potential. It showed that there are large numbers of people out there, probably the overwhelming majority, who could be won over to what might be called a class struggle platform. That was the main achievement of the Bernie Sanders candidacy, it brought to the surface something that was lying latent for quite a long time, but which very few people, certainly not me among them, was aware that existed until it was brought to the surface. Now, in my opinion, the main problem with that candidacy was not that it was lodged in the Democratic Party. The main problem was that Bernie simply did not follow through on what he promised to do. What do I mean by that? Whenever Bernie was interviewed about the most obvious question, Bernie, your platform is so radical, how do you think you're going to get it through Congress? It's not possible, your platform. Which was, to any sane person, that was a perfectly obvious question. And Bernie consistently gave the obvious and, in my opinion, correct answer. Namely, he said, of course you're right. We couldn't get that platform through until and unless, he said, we bring masses of people into the streets. You had to organize the masses of people, and then, as it were, through pressure, and then some pressure, and then some pressure again, sit-downs, sit-ins, mass arrests, that's how you make change. What happened? Bernie said he was running simultaneously a revolution and a primary. It was two things at once. It was both a primary campaign and a revolution. He said, Our Revolution, the title of his book. I think it was, but also his campaign. In any event, once he lost the primary, the revolution part dissolved. It disappeared. Bernie embraced the presidential Democratic nominee. In my opinion, I don't want to be hard on the guy. You know, he's an old man and he's a trooper. He's still out there. I wish I had his sheer physical strength when I'm his age, you know? He did not want to be held culpable if Trump won. It was like a personal burden he was unwilling to bear. And so if he had struck out independently in any way, if he had not unreservedly given his support to Biden, then if Biden lost, Bernie would have been blamed. And he wasn't ready to accept that. Once Biden was in office, Bernie had a choice. The choice was, go back to your promise. Bring out masses of people to force something through Congress. That's what a radical does. When you read Rosa Luxemburg, she says there are two things radicals do. They educate the masses and they organize the masses. Educate and organize. That's what it means to be a radical. Educate the masses, organize the masses. Your first purpose is not to get some piece of legislation passed, even though, of course, you would like to get that legislation passed. Your first purpose is organize, educate the masses, and push that legislation through. That's not what the so-called squad does. There are no attempts by the so-called squad to organize people. There are no attempts by the squad to educate people. They just want to operate behind the scenes, the same wheeling and dealing inside Congress. Okay, maybe some of their legislation is good. Fine. They're good liberals, but don't say they're radicals, because it has nothing to do with radicalism. Nothing whatsoever. 0, 0, 0. Now, Bernie had the choice. And for various reasons, he chose better to be close to Biden's ear, to be, so to speak, Biden's conscience, than to try to call people to Washington. You could have called masses of people to go to West Virginia and educate West Virginians about what Manchin is doing. Why didn't you attempt that? If you had brought millions of people to West Virginia and said, look what your senator is doing. He's just selling you out to all these rich companies. They weren't insurmountable obstacles. Biden and, her name just slipped my mind. Sinema. Just realize how ridiculous that is. Bernie said he was going to take on all of Congress, which we knew were going to be a brick wall to his program. But if you couldn't even win against Sinema and Manchin, then your whole program was nonsense. It was all just pie in the sky. And he should have said that. He should have said, well, I never expected to get my program through. But if you have that program and you think 2 senators are an obstacle, how could we have gotten anything through? So I think Bernie abandoned the very strategy which he himself during the campaign kept reiterating was the only way to get any of this legislation through. Mass mobilization, mass organization, mass education. He didn't do it, so it's unsurprising that it didn't happen.
We'll have to bring our event to a close. Please join me in a round of applause for Norman Finkelstein.